I'm going to begin by posing a question that I think we really can't ask often enough. What is the purpose of education? And I think that's a question upon which most of us would agree. The purpose of education is to prepare young people for their life after school. Now, I'd like you to think about your own education for a moment. What was your experience of your education? And to what extent did it really prepare you for life after school? Now, if for you, your schooling was an enriching experience that really prepared you well for your life after school, then you're in the fortunate minority. Because for the vast majority of us, myself included, school was something that had to be endured, not something that was relished. Now, why is that? For as human beings, we have a great innate curiosity. You only have to look at a toddler for a few moments to see how curious they are, open to the world. And in fact, this desire to know and understand the world around us is one of the fundamental things that makes us human. And so if that's the case, why is learning at school for so many of us a negative and perhaps dreary experience? For me, the answer is clear. It's to do with the model of education that we are using. Our current education system, with its great emphasis on high-stakes exams and testing, creates an impediment for learning. Now, tests should be testing what the children have learned, but instead of that, they end up learning for the test. So, what is Steiner education, and how is it different to mainstream education? Well, like we just said, I think Steiner wouldn't disagree with that. Education is about preparing young people for life in the real world, life after school. But he said more than that. He said, education is about social renewal, facilitating social renewal. For he lived in troubled times, times of political strife, economic strife. The times we live in today are just as challenging, if not more so, with all the environmental issues, COVID, and many difficulties. And so the world is in need of renewal, of healing. And perhaps education is one of the greatest leverage points for affecting this positive change. If we can educate children in such a way that they have the self-belief, the desire and the understanding to make a positive difference in the world, then education can serve an even deeper purpose. But how do we prepare young people for life after school? Not by giving them just lots of knowledge that they've memorized. I think even at the best of times, all the knowledge we remembered at school wasn't hugely useful in our lives. And now, with the internet, at the click of a button, it's all there. So how useful is just memorizing a vast swathe of knowledge? We can try to equip young people with practical skills that they can use in their life. But many of these skills that we might teach them may no longer be relevant in the future. So how do we prepare them for an uncertain world, an ever-changing world, full of challenges? Well, we need to cultivate in them core human capacities, that of self-confidence, compassion, empathy, social awareness, resilience, and creative thinking. And with these core human capacities, whatever situation, wherever they find themselves, whatever difficulty, they'll have the creativity and the confidence to find solutions to those problems and to live fulfilling and happy lives. Now, you may have been to many schools that say our education is about nurturing creativity, self-confidence, compassion. If they teach the national curriculum, then they may be saying they're doing that, but their scope for actually achieving that is minimal. Because the pressure on students and teachers alike to get good exam results within the national curriculum is too great. It doesn't allow the space to really nurture these deeper capacities. In fact, it can have a very detrimental effect on people's self-confidence, on their mental health, and on their creativity. So these are quite high aims of Steiner education, to nurture these core human capacities. And you might say that they're difficult to measure, and that's true. They may be difficult to measure in a formal sense in an exam or in a test, but they're easy to observe, to sense. They're palpable. I think this is best demonstrated by when strangers come into our schools and they can see, they can feel there's something different about these children. So in the times before COVID, we used to have our open days at school. And my colleague, who used to run the open day, said it wasn't a good open day if at least one parent hadn't broken down into tears during the open day. Now why were they crying? It wasn't that bad or scary. No, they were crying because to see children so happy and natural and engaged and joyful in their learning was such a stark contrast to their own experience of education that it moved them to tears. And very often it was the dads. And seeing a big macho man breaking down into tears, being so moved by seeing our children. That was a common sight pretty much every open day. Another example of this was when I took my class up to Scotland for an outdoor education holiday, adventure holiday. Now, this was based in a centre in the Highlands that has had thousands of schools over the years come to visit them. And the man, Chris, who ran the centre, after a day or so, he was like, "So, what's all this Steiner education about then?" Because he noticed that there was something fundamentally different about our young people. He'd seen thousands of children from hundreds of schools, and something about our children was unique. And what did he talk about? They were somehow more comfortable in their own skin. They had a self-confidence, humility, creativity, and physical skill, strength, and stamina. And this was evident in a few examples that I'll give. The first one was when they were rock climbing. And apparently, normally with kids of that age, when you've taught them how to be there for each other, how to put on the harnesses and what to do, they're so distractible that you have to keep reminding them. And even though their friend's halfway up the cliff, they're getting distracted by this or that. But he said that our children were just totally present and focused on what they were doing and on looking after their friend who was climbing the wall. And not only that, but apparently their climbing skills were off the scale. Because right from kindergarten, the children are climbing trees and exploring the world with their bodies. Another example was when we were climbing the Munros. Not only were they stunned by the ease and joy with which they skipped up these rugged mountains of Scotland, but as they did so, they were singing Mozart in 6 parts to entertain themselves. So these children were highly cultured and just different to what they were used to. One more example of this was on a rainy day where they had to cancel what we'd planned. They organised a treasure hunt. Because they're so used to having to occupy children for every half an hour, have that timetabled, next thing to do, next thing to do, next thing to do. So they took our children to the beach. It had been raining, and with the rain had soaked into the pebbles and given them this beautiful, shining, iridescent colours, like precious stones. And our children were so mesmerised by the beauty of these stones that rather than going on the treasure hunt, they started building these very elaborate, magnificent palaces and forts out of the sand and the stones, and then adorning them with seaweed and roof gardens of wildflowers. And they were there for half the day, totally absorbed in this creative process. So not only were our young people more self-confident, more mature, but there was also an innocence and a creativity that could endure for a longer period. Children were allowed to be children and not forced into the pressures of adolescence and teen image and life prematurely. So these are just a few examples of how people from the outside world have noticed our children and felt the profound impact of our education. So how do we do it? I'll just give you a brief sketch of some of the fundamental pillars of our education and how it's different to mainstream education. So firstly, I would say that mainstream education is one-sided towards the head, the intellect. There's a great emphasis on memorization and on factual knowledge. In fact, Ofsted equate learning with this act of memorizing knowledge. Whereas in our schools, we like to have a balance between the head, the heart, and the hands. So there's an equal balance between academic learning, between creativity, drama, music, and the arts, and between our hands, doing practical work, cleaning, gardening, cooking, crafting skillfully with our hands. These aren't extracurricular activities, they all have a central part, role in our curriculum, and they're actually embedded. So they're not just taught as separate subjects, but our core learning has craft elements, has artistic elements. And through this, the children engage much more deeply and much more joyfully with their learning. So another pillar of education would be outdoor education. Our young people today, many of them suffer, as adults do, with nature deficit. There's a disconnect with the natural world, and this has disastrous consequences on our mental health. So right from the early years, right through to the upper school, children spend a lot of time outdoors, developing this deep connection and reverence with the natural world. First of all, through free play in the kindergartens, and then in the lower school through bushcraft and stories, green woodwork and foraging, and much more. And then in the upper school, there's an emphasis on voluntary work. They go back to those places and they're taking care of them, coppicing and clearing land, and also learning from professionals, learning from beekeepers, farmers, and more. Creativity is another cornerstone of education, and in the early years, this is through free play. Children are given the space to play freely. And in the lower school, that's through narrative, through storytelling, the spoken word, and through an artistic approach to teaching. And in the upper school, these imaginative faculties emerge as creative thinking abilities, which are challenged through a problem-solving, project-based approach to teaching. So these are some of the ways in which our education is different. And as I said, from my perspective, Steiner education holds many of the keys to allowing this paradigm shift in education, which is so important for the health and the mental health of our young people and of the planet. Thank you.